Evil villain or slandered victim? Today we uncover the real story of John Rackcliffe, former governor of Jamestown Colony in the early 1600s. Remembered by many only as the greedy villain from Disney's Pocahontas. But the truth behind his life, his death, and the way pop culture has twisted his legacy matters more than you think. We'll set the record straight and expose the deeper cultural subversion attacking Western civilization in the popular entertainment we so often consume without question. That's today on The Restless Signal. Welcome to The Restless Signal, where we seek truth, wrestle with meaning, and strive to live well. I'm the voice of the signal, and together, we're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. I think you're going to enjoy today's transmission. I've always loved history. I've always had a soft spot for movies based on real events. Not documentaries. I don't mind some dramatization, a little artistic license to make a good movie work. As long as it stays true to the essence of the story and the character of the real people, I'm fine with it. Some of my favorite films take history and make it vivid, human, and alive. That's probably why when Disney's Pocahontas came out in the mid-90s, I watched it as a preteen and enjoyed it. Later, I even showed it to my kids. I knew it was dramatized. I knew they had changed some things, like inventing the love story between John Smith and Pocahontas, and certainly there are no real talking trees. It's a cartoon, after all. But I didn't realize I was consuming rank propaganda. But this week, I saw a post on X, and it educated me on just how far from the truth it actually was. And not in small, harmless ways. Not in the, we merged a couple of side characters, or condensed the timeline, or glossed over some complexity, or made it safe and fun for kids. Not those kind of ways. No. I mean in ways that take a real man and completely invert who he was, turning him into the opposite. That's what happened to John Rackcliffe, the second governor of Jamestown Colony. His real story should command respect. Instead, it was twisted into a cartoonish villain role. The people who wronged him were turned into moral heroes. That's just not inaccurate. It's an injustice. And injustice, even in the retelling of history, demands to be set right. And here's the thing. This isn't just about one man or one movie. This was a battle over truth and meaning that fits into a much broader war of ideas. One that has been waged subversively for decades against Western civilization, specifically Western Christianity, to poison the way we see our past, our present, and our future. As I said in my previous episode on Frozen and the counterfeit virtues of modern Disney, the entertainment we consume and the stories we tell are vital to the health of our culture. Disney doesn't just make up harmless fairy tales anymore. They package morally corrosive ideas in the false language of virtue. But with Pocahontas, they went even further. They rewrote actual history and corrupted the truth. So today, we're going to talk about the real story, the one Disney inverted, the truth about who this man was, what really happened, and why it matters. Because when you change the truth about the past, you don't just rewrite history. You corrupt the way people discern right from wrong and whether they see their cultural inheritance as worthy of defending. So if we care about what's really happening, there's only one right way to answer lies and subversion, with justice and truth. If you've seen Disney's Pocahontas, you already know that John Rackcliffe they put on screen. But let's set the stage. The film opens in England with Rackcliffe leading an expedition to the New World. On board are a crew of settlers, including John Smith, the daring, adventurous soldier who became the romantic lead. Rackcliffe's reason for making the journey is plainly stated from the start. Gold. Not for England, not to secure the survival of a new colony, for himself. His big villain song, Mine, 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 is a campy ode to greed, marching his men into the wilderness to tear the land apart in search of treasure. Across the ocean, we meet Pocahontas, the spirited daughter of Chief Powhatan, resisting her father's plan to marry her off to the dependable warrior Kokum. She's drawn instead to the dreams of something more. When the English arrive, Rackcliffe stakes his claim, orders his men to dig, and treats the native inhabitants as an obstacle to be removed. His attitude towards them is openly hostile, dismissing them as savages, refusing to consider their perspective, and seeing any contact as a threat to his authority. In the middle of this, Pocahontas and John Smith meet. Their forbidden romance becomes the heart of the film, a bridge between two worlds. Pocahontas teaches Smith about harmony, respect for the earth, and living in peace. He shows her the world beyond Virginia. But Rackcliffe is the constant force of escalation. When a skirmish leaves Cockham dead, shot by Thomas, a young settler who was trying to protect Smith, both sides prepare for war. Ratcliffe fans the flames, determined to wipe out the Powhatan, convinced they are hiding gold. He manipulates his men with fear, warping events to fit his narrative. In the climax, as Chief Powhatan prepares to execute Smith in retaliation, Pocahontas throws herself between them, convincing her father to release him and choose peace. Rackcliffe refuses to accept it. In a final act of treachery, he tries to assassinate Powhatan, only for Smith to take the bullet. Ratcliffe's own men turn on him in disgust, binding him and shipping him back to England in chains. And that's the last we see of him, humiliated, defeated, and stripped of dignity. This is the John Ratcliffe Disney gave us. Vain, greedy, racist, cowardly, and power-hungry to the bitter end. A man whose every action in the story is driven by arrogance, selfishness, and cruelty. He wears a heavy purple cape in the Virginia summer like a badge of his vanity, struts like royalty, and parades around with his little pug Percy as a symbol of his pampered arrogance. He's a one-note villain, the embodiment of colonial greed and moral bankruptcy. This film doesn't just make him flawed, it gives him no redeeming qualities whatsoever. If you only knew this version of Rackcliffe, you'd walk away convinced he was among the worst men ever to set foot on American soil. And you never imagine how far this portrayal is from the truth. The real John Rackcliffe story begins far from the New World, in England, sometime in the late 1500s. He was born John Sycamore, not a household name then, and certainly not now. And like many ambitious men of his era, he was drawn into the great adventure of the Virginia Company. This was no vacation cruise. It was a joint stock gamble to plant a permanent English settlement in a distant, dangerous, and uncharted land. When Sycamore signed up for the 1607 voyage to what would become Jamestown, he adopted a new name, John Rackcliffe, perhaps to give himself a fresh start, perhaps to lend more weight to his new station. Jamestown in those early years was not the lush, harmonious paradise Disney painted. It was a muddy, mosquito-infested settlement pressed between the vast forests and the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, so named by historians after their paramount chief. The leading tribe oversaw 38 tributary tribes and controlled thousands of square miles in the Tidewater, Virginia region. Jamestown was plagued by disease, poor sanitation, brackish water, political infighting, and constant uncertainty about where the next meal would come from. The colony's survival hinged on leadership that could secure food, manage relations with the Powhatan, and keep morale from collapsing entirely. Rackcliffe rose quickly. After Edward Wingfield was deposed as president, also called a governor, Rackcliffe became the second governor of Jamestown. That title did not come with comfort or security. Governors of Jamestown were in the thick of it. They negotiated with Powhatan emissaries, they managed rationing in times of scarcity, and they led expeditions that were likely to end in bloodshed, as in trade. Rackcliffe eventually resigned his leadership in 1608 due to colonists being dissatisfied with various elements of his leadership, including the decision to build a governor's house. But there's no record of him ordering atrocities against the Powhatans. Indeed, one of the colonial complaints about his tenure was he was too generous in his trade deals. The greatest test of the young colony came in what history remembers as the Starving Time, the winter of 1609 through 1610. Tensions with the Powhatan had escalated, and they had put Jamestown under siege, cutting off much access to the surrounding land and choking off vital food supplies. Inside the fort, disease spread. Hunger gnawed at every belly, and the population withered. Accounts from the winter remain among the grimmest in early American history. Horses and dogs eaten, rats and snakes hunted, even boiled leather chewed for some scraps of sustenance. Archaeology has since confirmed what some of the accounts hinted at, that in their desperation, some colonists resorted to cannibalism. By the time the siege lifted, only about 60 of the 500 settlers were still alive. It was during this siege and period of starvation that Rackcliffe made the decision that would cost him his life. In around December 1609, with the colony desperate for food, Henry Spelman, a young Englishman who was living with the Powhatans for a time, approached the colony with an offer of peaceful trade. The governor of the colony at the time, George Percy, dispatched Rackcliffe to lead a party of around 25 men up the James River to trade with the Powhatans for food. This was not a war raid, it was a mission of survival, a calculated risk to make peace, however temporary, in order to keep his people from starving. The account we have says Rackcliffe let his guard down in two ways. First, when the chief's daughter and son came aboard their boat, he let them go freely rather than keeping them as leverage for safety. Second, when his group met with the Powhatans, he failed to keep a proper guard and allowed his men to scatter into individual houses to trade. In those moments, it must have seemed that the mission had succeeded, a fragile bridge across the gulf of mistrust. But it was a trap. The Powhatan warriors exploited Ratcliffe's naivete and struck. Most of his men were cut down in the ambush. Rackcliffe himself was taken alive, and what followed remains one of the most harrowing episodes in colonial history. Governor Percy, in A True Relation, wrote that Rackcliffe was bound naked to a stake before a fire, where Powhatan women tortured him, scraping the skin from his body piece by piece with mussel shells, and feeding each strip into the flames before his eyes. Percy's account is brief but vivid, leaving no doubt about the cruelty of the act. And that was how John Rackcliffe died. Not in pursuit of gold, not in some self-serving scheme, but in an act of service to his people, leading a mission to bring food to a starving colony, trusting in the promise of trade, and paying for that trust with a slow and brutal death. Was he flawless? Of course not. No leader in that raw and desperate world was. Jamestown politics were frayed, and he had his share of disputes and missteps. But to erase the reality of his final act, to strip away the context of the siege, the starvation, the risk he took to save his people, and to replace it with a caricature of greed and cruelty is not just historically wrong, it's an injustice. This is the man Disney recast as a buffoonish villain in Purple Cape. This is the man they turned into a punchline. And once you see the distance between the truth and the lie, the question becomes inescapable. How do you go to that from this? How do you look at the story of a man who died in service to his people and decide to make him the embodiment of everything he was not? Now, before we go any further, I know some of you are thinking, sure, that's what the English said happened, but isn't that just colonial propaganda? How do we know this isn't some exaggerated tale cooked up to demonize the Powhatan and justify whatever the English wanted to do next? It's a fair question, because history is full of victors who polish their own side and blacken the other. But in this case, the evidence lines up in a way that makes fabrication very unlikely. First, the sources. Our most detailed account comes from George Percy, the governor at the time. His True Relation gives a short but vivid description of Rackcliffe's capture and torture. While Percy's source is not named as far as I can tell, other secondary sources conclude it was from Captain William Thedleplace, who escaped the ambush. Percy's account also broadly aligns with what was later written by Henry Spelman in his memoirs, Relation of Virginia. Spelman, who, as noted earlier, was living with the Powhatan at the time, described Rackcliffe and his men arriving to trade, a dispute arising over the exchange, and the moments leading up to the ambush. Second, the method. What Percy describes is consistent with what we know from other 17th century sources about the Powhatan and the wider Algonquian peoples and their warfare practices in the region. The use of shells, the public nature of the killing, and the intent to cause terror. These were real features of the conflict at the time. Third, there's the question of motive. If you're going to fabricate propaganda to impress investors back in London or justify a military campaign, you'd usually paint yourself as a stronger and victorious, not gullible and humiliated. But here, the English come off as exactly that: tricked, trapped, and slaughtered. That's not the sort of story you invent if you're trying to raise morale or protect your reputation. And fourth and finally, modern academic scholarship in this area supports Percy's account as largely true, not a fabrication for propaganda purposes. The Encyclopedia of Virginia, a project of the Library of Virginia, records Rackcliffe's betrayal, torture, and death at the hands of the Powhatans as historical fact. Other reputable outlets, including Smithsonian Magazine, recount the same event. I could find no credible academic movement that seriously questions the core facts of Rackcliffe's fate. So yes, we should always examine any historical source with a critical eye, but in this case, the weight of the evidence, the cultural context, and the scholarly consensus all point in the same direction. The core of the story is true. Which makes what Disney did all the more appalling, because they didn't take a myth and turn it into a fable, or create a fictional character to be the villain of a so-called true story. No, they took a real man's real death, documented by his contemporaries and accepted by historians, and inverted it. They took the victim and made him the villain. And that was no accident. This wasn't an innocent mistake. It wasn't a slip of the pen by some inattentive screenwriter. The rewriting of John Rackliffe's life and death was deliberate, and it served several purposes at once. First, it was a cynical play for prestige. By the mid-1990s, Disney was chasing Oscars as aggressively as it was chasing box office revenue. Then studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg was open about his desire to position Pocahontas as the studio's next great critical triumph. Within Disney at the time, Pocahontas was actually considered the studio's A project, the one expected to be the next Beauty and the Beast, while The Lion King was seen as the B project, a side effort. That's astonishing in hindsight, given what Lion King became. But Katzenberg wanted Pocahontas to be the prestige picture, high-minded themes, lush visuals, and a moral fable that critics could treat as serious art. It was built from the ground up to be Disney's next big picture contender. Second, it required a villain who could be both unmistakable and uncomplicated, someone the audience could unite against without moral ambiguity. They didn't want the messy reality of cross-cultural misunderstandings, trade negotiations, and shifting alliances. They wanted a sneering embodiment of greed and cruelty, someone who could carry the full weight of the story's moral condemnation. And so Rackcliffe, the real man, who in truth died in a horrific act of betrayal, was stripped of his history, flattened into a caricature, and made to bear crimes he never committed. But the problem was that it wasn't just a lie, it was a boring lie. As one retrospective review written in 2022 by Alexandria Phillips puts it, quote, "The British governor is neither intimidating nor humorous enough to make a mark as a significant villain in the Disney lineup. Rackcliffe is motivated by greed and nothing else, cementing him as a mundane foe." Finally, this rewrite fit comfortably into a broader cultural current gaining momentum in the 1990s, one that sought to delegitimize America's founding by painting its earliest settlers as uniformly corrupt, bigoted, and brutal. This was not simply about one movie or one character. It was about reinforcing a narrative that the roots of America and Western Christian civilization were rotted from the start, and that the entire project was built on exploitation and oppression. Rackliffe's fictional transformation wasn't just entertainment, it was part of a larger campaign to subvert Western civilization. So, now that we know the truth, what do we do about it? I think there's 4 things. First, Disney needs to do justice to John Rackcliffe. They defamed a victim, a man who, according to the historical record, was acting in good faith, trying to save his people from starvation, and who died in one of the most horrific betrayals in colonial history. In Disney's telling, his killers became sympathetic, and he becomes the villain. If they can slap a trigger warning in front of Peter Pan to warn that the depictions of Indians doesn't match real life, as if anyone thought the cartoon was a documentary, then they can certainly put a disclaimer in Pocahontas to set the record straight. They owe him that much, and we owe him that much, because the truth matters, and a man's name matters. Second, we need to stop giving Disney, and Hollywood in general, the benefit of the doubt. They've spent their goodwill. When they tell a story based on true events, we should approach it not just with mild skepticism, but with a working assumption that it will be fundamentally a dishonest project. Not just dramatized, not just artistic license, a calculated piece of propaganda aimed at undermining our history and our civilization in the war of ideas. That means we have to stop reflectively assuming their intentions are innocent, stop letting our guard down because it's for kids, and start treating every true story they tell us as something that requires fact-checking before it's allowed to shape how we see our past. Third, when we do watch these films, we have to equip our children to separate fact from fiction, and we have to do it intentionally. That means pausing the movie and talking about what really happened. It means showing them that Rackliffe's real story is not only more truthful, but often far more interesting and dramatic than Disney's caricature. It means explaining the stories are never neutral. They always serve some vision of the world, whether noble or corrupt. We need to educate them that there is a war of ideas being waged against Western Christian civilization, and across every front, there are battles over truth and meaning being waged. So they need to be aware to take in media critically and ask the right questions. Why was the truth changed? Who benefits from the new version? What moral lesson is being smuggled in with the new story? If we want our kids to grow up wise, we have to train their instincts so that when someone tries to slip them counterfeit history or counterfeit virtues, they recognize it on sight. And finally, to those with the means, the talent, and the passion for storytelling, we need you now more than ever. The American right has often treated art as a decoration, as an optional add-on to the real work of politics or policy or hands-on practical labor. That is a catastrophic mistake. The left has been playing the long game for decades in the war of ideas, using film, television, and literature to shape the moral imagination of entire generations. They understand that if you can tell the story, you can shape the culture. And if you can shape the culture, you win the future. We need to start playing the same game, but better. That means investing real money, time, and energy into creating stories that are not just technically competent, but morally grounded, culturally confident, and rooted in truth. Stories that make people proud of what's good in their civilization, not ashamed of it. Stories that make young people want to be virtuous, not cynical. If we continue surrendering this ground, if we lose the war of ideas, no political victory will save us, because the culture will have already been remade in someone else's image. So to wrap up, we learned today that what Disney did to John Rackcliffe wasn't a harmless embellishment. It was a deliberate act of historical vandalism. In life, Rackcliffe was a leader caught between hunger, diplomacy, and danger, trying to guide his people through a brutal winter. In death, he was betrayed and killed in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. And centuries later, Disney rewrote him into a cartoon of greed and malice, stripping away his humanity and turning a victim into the villain. This is what happens when we give up the battlefield of storytelling. This specific battle over truth and meaning in the War of Ideas was lost in 1995. Truth was not just bent, it was inverted by Disney. Victim became villain. Villain became sympathetic. And an entire generation grew up believing they had learned history, when what they had really absorbed was propaganda. John Rackcliffe deserved better. We deserve better. And our children deserve better. If we care about the truth, if we care about our history, if we care about forming the next generation with moral clarity instead of counterfeit virtue, then we have to fight for it in the classrooms, in books, and the stories told on the biggest screens in the world. Those committed to the good and the true can and must reclaim the battlefield. We must raise up a generation who knows the difference between fact and fiction and who can spot a counterfeit the moment it's set before them. But even more than that, we must tell our history and stories truthfully, boldly, and without apology, acknowledging both our flaws and sins, but also our many virtues and accomplishments. And when we do, we will build a better future, one where our stories strengthen rather than weaken us, where the truth is treasured rather than twisted, and where the names of people that struggled through centuries of hardship to bequeath to us our great civilization, people like John Rackcliffe, have their names and honor restored at last. That's it for today's show. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this content, I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed. It really helps us out. Until next time, seek truth, wrestle with meaning, live well, and above all, keep the signal clear. You've been listening to the Restless Signal podcast. Copyright 2025, all rights reserved. Check us out on the web at therestlesssignal.com.